Okay, so let's jump right in. We're going to start by assessing for where each cranial bone is located. Remember, we said that it varies on different people. And so I'm going to start, as I've taught you to do, with the frontal bone. We're going to palpate and follow it. And our frontal bone extends to about here. If we slide it a little further out, our sphenoid is right about here. So if we follow our frontal bone, and then palpate very gently, either with your thumbs, your fingertips, and in an area where it's a little bit soft and sensitive to the client, that's when we know that we've reached our coronal suture. So our frontal bone in our client is actually right about here. Our sphenoid, we can feel it because the tissues are always a little bit spongy, a little bit softer. So her sphenoid is actually just at the end of her eyebrow. It's not further down here, it's right up here. Next, I'm going to come around and I'm going to feel for her temporal bones. Now her temporal bones, I'm just going to grab the zygomatic process in front of the ear and then get around the back with my other fingers around the mastoid. Insert my middle finger, I've shown you this technique before, and I'm just going to feel for its overall location, its overall mobility. I'm going to slide in a little bit and I'm going to feel for the space in between the mastoid process and the jawline, and feel for whether or not it's even on both sides, and this gives me an overall idea of where the temporal bone is located in space. Next, I'm going to come around the back and I'm going to palpate for her occipital bone. So I'm going to come under with both hands and I'm just going to locate it. I'm going to follow the ledge or the ridge under which the bone meets the first cervical vertebrae. So it's important for those of you who are not accustomed to feeling for bone that you be able to locate that edge, that ledge right there. Follow your fingers out until you get to that little V notch. Your client will often tell you it's sensitive, so now you know that you've gotten to the occipitotemporal suture, and that means that in her, in fact, our occiput is actually quite narrow. So we're going to bring our hands in close together, and now I've located her occiput overall, and a lot like her frontal, it's narrow and it comes around over the top to right about here. Next, I'm going to feel for her parietals. So since we know that her temporals were located about here, the body of the temporal, overall in space, the location of her temporals is actually quite far back and quite wide. That means that our parietals are actually quite small and narrow, and they're right up here. So this is why it's important to take the time to verify the bony landmarks so that we can get an overall idea of the shape of the head that we're going to be working on, just as you would do a postural assessment. Next, I'm just going to check very quickly the sutures. I'm going to check the coronal suture. I've located it overall, so I'm going to feel for it, and it actually feels quite spongy and rather healthy. And now I'm going to work my way across the top through to the back, and I'm going to assess the sagittal suture. And in fact, I find that just very close, very proximal to the coronal suture, at that very important intersection point, I feel the tissues and the bone underneath quite hard. So with time and experience, you'll come to see what a suture, when it is compacted, feels like. It'll feel harder under your fingers, but on her, as I work my way to the back, I can feel that it's actually quite soft. So I feel like I'm actually pressing on scalp tissue, but in some areas of the suture I feel like I'm pressing on hard bone. This tells us that the suture is somewhat compacted in that area. Next, I'm going to be checking all of her cranial bones. So I like to start at the occiput. Many therapists do this because what are we doing? We are verifying the sphenobasilar symphysis, which is the prime driver of all of the bones. This is the cranial base, so there's a lot taking place back here. So this is going to be our first place that we're going to assess. And we're going to listen with our hands for flexion and extension. Now, of course, even in class and in a live class, it's not easy for me to show you what that feels like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just verbally describe what I'm feeling as we go. So in our client, I can feel now that her occiput is moving into flexion. I've noticed that her cervical spine doesn't flex very much, but now as I follow her flexion, I feel like it goes quite deeply, quite long. Very good. And now as it moves into extension, I find that she doesn't have full range of motion in extension. It seems to stop about halfway, and it stops even sooner on the right side. So we have some restricted range of motion of the occiput in extension on the right side. Now I'm going to slide my hand across, so her head is now resting in my hand in the occipital area, and I'm going to come across the top with my other hand, and I'm going to listen to the occiput in relation to the sphenoid. So what I'm hoping for is to feel whether or not the sphenoid is moving in harmony with the occiput. As the occiput moves into flexion, is the sphenoid also actually moving down into flexion? Is it doing so fully in flexion? Listen for the range of motion on your client. And then, is it moving fully into extension? I feel like it's moving well into extension on the left side, but not so much on the right. So we seem to have some restriction in the sphenobasilar symphysis, the occiput and the sphenoid on that right side. Keep that in mind, because in another chapter we're going to learn how to chart all of this. Using practice charting to be able to make notes of what we found will help us to identify the areas that we need to treat, patterns that we might find, and plan for future sessions, as well as monitor the results of your treatments. So now let's